Alright guys, I saw this video a while back and I've been wanting to do a response on it for some time now. Basically, the video claims to debunk Aquinas' Unmoved Mover, but as you'll see in just a second, it doesn't succeed at all. So let's get into it.
So I've been meaning to take on Thomas Aquinas' Unmoved Mover, or Prime Mover, for quite some time now. But when I woke up this morning and saw for the first time a Prager University video titled God vs. Atheism, which is more rational, I simply had to drop all other projects to jump on this nonsense immediately, while I'm still furious. This is the Unmoved Mover Debunked.
Alright, well at this point you know it's gotta be good. But you also think about when you're furious, you're not thinking very logically. Usually you're using your passion to decide decisions, so you may want to relax and use your intellect.
In the interest of keeping this video relevant, I'm going to address Kreeft's specific rendition of the Unmoved Mover, rather than Aquinas', because while the two differ in the language and references that they use, they are nevertheless fundamentally the same.
But wait a second, I thought he just said that he was debunking Aquinas' argument, and that's literally the name of the video. It is literally Thomas Aquinas' Unmoved Mover Debunked.
And so, here's Kreeft presenting the argument.
While the average person might think this is okay, in logic it's not. It's absolutely not okay whatsoever, because a single word can make or break an argument. And if you're going to use someone else's language and say it was this other person's language, then gee, you could put any words you want in their mouth. And that's exactly what happens here. But the show must go on, so we're going to see if what he even presents is accurately portraying what Aquinas said.
The argument starts with the not very startling observation that things move. But nothing moves for no reason. Something must cause that movement. And whatever caused that must be caused by something else, and so on. But this causal chain cannot go backwards forever. It must have a beginning. There must be an unmoved mover to begin all the motion in the universe, a first domino to start the whole chain moving, since mere matter never moves itself.
So, straight from the outset, I want to point out two absolutely devastating flaws.
I'd like to point out a couple devastating flaws myself with your presentation of the argument. It's that pretty much every premise you present is a straw man and not what Aquinas himself believed. Vocab break. A straw man is an intentionally misrepresented preposition that is set up because it is easier to defeat than an opponent's real argument. So basically what that means is you take a pretty good argument, you make a caricature of it so it's not nearly as good, and then you knock it down because it's very easy to do. Take the first premise for instance. Kreeft says,
the argument starts with the not very startling observation that things move.
Notice how then the guy from Rationality Rules places the word everything in Kreeft's mouth when he types out everything that exists is in motion for the first premise. This in itself is bad enough as it is putting words in someone else's mouth, a clearly evident straw man, but just to go the extra mile and show that what Rationality Rules presents for the first premise is not what Aquinas believed or presented, we're going to hear from Mathema on why that's not what the argument says. I will explain who Mathema is in just a minute.
There's another point I need to address concerning these main cosmological arguments, and this comes up again and again in both popular atheist literature and philosophical arguments. The point is that not one of the cosmological arguments begins with the premise, everything has a cause. As I said before, the argument always begins with a premise such as, that which is X has a cause. The X being many different things. For example, that which is composite has a cause, or that which goes from potential to actual has a cause, or that which is distinguished between essence and existence has a cause. This is simply not the same as saying that everything, full stop, no matter what, has a cause. This misunderstanding of the form of the premises within the cosmological arguments leads to the following straw man of what theists are saying. First, everything has a cause, so that means the universe must have a cause, and that cause must have been God, and therefore God exists. But wait, you said that everything has a cause, so what caused God? If you say nothing, then you've contradicted that statement that everything has a cause. But if you say God is self-caused, whatever that means, then why can't the universe be self-caused too? Why does it have to be God that causes the universe? Now, this silly cartoon of the cosmological arguments takes up an inordinate amount of time in philosophical argument. We're all agreed here, it's a dumb argument. Here's the thing. None of the major philosophers or theologians has ever made this stupid argument. I encourage you to take me up on this challenge. Go back to the writings of the major philosophers, for example, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Scotus, or any others, and look to see if any of them argued for God's existence, starting from the premise everything has a cause. Unfortunately, the new atheists have convinced many people that natural theology rests upon such nonsense like everything has a cause and a stupid self-contradictory argument. This misrepresentation of the cosmological arguments is by no means an isolated occurrence among popular atheism. It appears to be the norm in atheist literature.
The first is that even if we accept every premise of Kreeft's presentation of this argument, all this would prove is that an unmoved mover existed, and that's it. Seriously, that's all it would prove.
Now I will agree with him in that the argument he presents would only prove that an unmoved mover existed, although we could reason to certain divine attributes after an unmoved mover is established, but that's another topic for another video.
It would not prove that this unmoved mover still exists.
Actually, as you're about to see with a true presentation of the argument, it really does prove that an unmoved mover still exists.
That it's a being, that it's conscious, or that it impregnated a virgin in order to sacrifice itself to itself so it could forgive you for your ancestors' actions. Or in other words, it would not prove that Kreeft's very specific interpretation of Christianity is true.
Well, actually, that's perfectly fine, because that's not what the argument's conclusion is. It's not. It's that an unmoved mover exists.
The second game-ending flaw with this argument is that premise 3, the assertion that something must have existed without a cause, is an obvious case of special pleading. A special pleading fallacy occurs when a proponent creates an exception to a rule without adequate justification, and that is precisely what premise 3 is doing. It is literally asserting that premise 2, the assertion that everything in motion is caused to be in motion by something else, applies to absolutely everything except for the cause of the universe, without adequately justifying why. In fact, by itself, the argument doesn't even attempt to substantiate this assertion, it just makes it.
So I'm gonna play a clip from Mathema here. He's a great YouTuber who has some awesome videos on philosophy and theology. This clip and the rest by Mathema that I'm going to present in this video come from his video titled A Defense of Classical Theology, Part 1, The New Atheism and the Cosmological Arguments. This video series is brilliant and I highly suggest everyone goes and watches it. This clip is going to, in more detail than the first, show why an infinite regression is impossible and why a person is adequately justified in saying so.
Because the question of infinite regress is approaching, we must talk about those two sorts of causal series that I spoke of earlier, those ordered accidentally, or per accidens in Latin, and those ordered essentially, or per se. Those causal series ordered accidentally extend backwards in time and contain members which do not essentially derive their causal power. In this case, their motive power from the previous member of the series. The previous members in the series could be suppressed, and later members would not lose their motive power. An example of this is the following. Imagine I'm making spaghetti and I need to boil some water. I fill a metal pot with water and get the flame going. That flame actualizes the potential for the metal pot to be hot, which in turn actualizes the water's potential to be hot, which in turn actualizes the spaghetti's potential to be hot once I drop that into the hot water. Since each one of these steps involves the actualization of a potential, it's an example of motion. And notice that each one of the steps occurred in a linear fashion extending backward in time, beginning with the flame actualizing the pot's potential to be hot. However, once the pot is hot, it can go on to actualize the water's potential to be hot, and what that means is that once the pot is actually hot, it possesses motive power to move the water on its own, even though the flame is no longer there. So the actually hot pot does not essentially derive its motive power from the flame, in that it continues to put the water into motion even in the absence of the flame. And once the water is hot, it may also put the spaghetti into motion even in the absence of the flame. Such a series of movers, ordered accidentally in this linear fashion, might in principle extend into the past to infinity. I happen to think not for other reasons. But this is not the sort of situation Aquinas is talking about here. And this is why talk of cosmological theories about the distant past has little to do with these sorts of arguments, particularly those given by Aquinas. Consider a different example of motion, one closer to what Aquinas is actually talking about in this argument. Imagine there's a stone on the ground, and you move the stone to your left using a stick in your right hand. The stone moves because the stick puts it into motion. But the stick is only able to put the stone into motion because the stick is itself being put into motion by the hand. And your hand only puts the stick into motion because your forearm puts the hand into motion. But here, if your forearm stopped actualizing the hand, the stick would fail to put the stone into motion. So the stick derives its motive power ultimately from the forearm. So you might actually say that ultimately, the stick isn't the thing moving the stone. It's your forearm that ultimately moves the stone. We can see that a series of this sort absolutely requires actualization from more fundamental members of the series. And getting rid of more fundamental members would halt the actualization of more distal members. That is, if the forearm stops putting the hand into motion, the stone stops moving because the stick derives its motive power from the forearm. Because each member in the series derives its motive power from a more fundamental member and does not possess motive power in their absence, such an example is a series of movers ordered essentially, or per se. This important feature, that more distal members of the series derive their motive power from more fundamental members, is what makes infinite regress impossible in such a series. To say that such a series regresses infinitely is to say that the stick ultimately doesn't derive its motive power from anything. If the stick doesn't derive its motive power from anything, there's no way it could do things like move stones, which plainly contradicts experience. Even if such a series could regress infinitely, something outside the series would have to supply the series with motive power, so that the stick derives its motive power from something that does actually contain motive power, and also doesn't need to derive it from something else. The actual physics in this example doesn't really matter here at all, and I'm aware you can analyze the situation in terms of Newtonian mechanics incorporating friction. If you don't like the example, simply substitute a different one. The key idea we're extracting from the example is that the motive power of each member in the series, that ability to actualize a potential, is essentially derived from a more fundamental member. And if more fundamental members fail, the rest of the series necessarily fails. Of course, the example I gave isn't really the full story. The forearm only contains its motive power because the biceps muscle contracts. So we might say that the stone is being moved by the contraction of the bicep muscle, ultimately. The story doesn't end there either. We can descend to deeper and deeper levels of reality in the here and now. The contraction of the biceps muscle, which is an actualization of a potential, only occurs because of the firing of motor neurons innervating the muscle. In this series of movers, if the neuron stops firing, the stick loses its motive power. And even the actualization of the potential for these motor neurons firing only occurs because of the shape or conformation of specialized ion channel proteins within the nerve. We can go further and further and descend into finer levels of reality, but the point is that each member in this series derives its ability to actualize a potential from a more fundamental member in the series.
So now we're going to hear from Dr. Edward Fazer on what Aquinas actually believed and how the unmoved mover argument is actually supposed to be laid out. This clip comes from a debate between Edward Fazer and Arif Ahmed on Premier Christian Radio.
It's traditionally called the argument from motion for an unmoved mover, but it's important to understand that for Aristotle, the way Aristotle and other Aristotelians use the word motion, what they have in mind is change generally, not just motion in the modern sense, which is what Aristotelians traditionally call local motion, change with respect to place or location. It's any kind of change, like you think of a banana, say, sitting on a windowsill, and as it gradually ripens, it goes from being green to yellow, say. That would be a kind of motion or change in Aristotle's sense. So the idea is that we know from experience that things are changing. And on Aristotle's analysis, what change involves is going from potential to actual. It's the actualization of a potential. And he develops this idea in reaction to pre-Socratic philosophers, ancient Greek philosophers like Parmenides and Zeno, who denied that change was possible. They thought change would have to involve going from nothingness to something. And Aristotle says that's not true. Change involves going from potentially being a certain way to being actually a certain way, as when the banana goes from being potentially yellow to actually being yellow. So that's the starting point. So we know from experience that things are changing. They go from potential to actual. How does this ever happen, though? How does anything ever actually undergo change? And the answer is that anytime something goes from potential to actual, there's something already actual that's making that happen. So take the tea in my cup next to me here in the room here. It goes from being hot to being cold, from being actually hot and potentially cold to being actually cold. And what causes that to happen is the cool air in the room surrounding it, which is already cool, cooler than the tea anyway, and it cools down the liquid in the cup. So we've got things changing, and they're being changed by other things. They go from potential to actual, and that's made to happen by some other thing that's already actual. Now, what the Aristotelian proof says is that when we trace this series of changers, one thing being changed by another, being changed by another, or to be more precise, one thing being actualized by another, being actualized by another, what we're doing is we're tracing a series of causes that doesn't just extend backward in time, but it extends, you might say, downward or upward, pick your metaphor, here and now. And ultimately, it depends on the sheer existence of things like the tea or the water that makes up the tea. The tea couldn't change at all unless it existed. The water that makes up the tea couldn't get cooler unless it existed. And its existence in itself depends on the actualization of certain potentials. So the fact that the water that makes up that tea, that partly makes up that tea, it's hydrogen and oxygen. And the molecules that make it up potentially could form some other substance, but instead they form water. And so there must be some reason here and now why that's the case, something that actualizes that potential rather than some other. So the idea is that when we trace causes downward here and now, or again upward if you want to use that metaphor instead, we trace them downward here and now, what we get is one thing being actualized by another, being actualized by another. And the only place the buck can stop, the only place we can reach an ultimate explanation, is if we get to something that can actualize all these other things without itself being actualized. It's what I call in the book an unactualized actualizer, or a purely actual actualizer. It can actualize everything else without itself being actualized because it's already always, as it were, purely actual. It's got no potentials that need to be or could be actualized. So it's a kind of uncaused cause in a traditional sense, meaning not one that simply happens to lack a cause, but something that could not have had a cause in principle because it's already pure actuality and in no way potential.
And this brings us perfectly to the crux of Kreeft's faulty reasoning. In his attempt to prove that an unmoved mover does indeed exist, he offers us two additional faulty arguments. The first is the assertion that
we now know that all matter, that is, the whole universe, came into existence some 13.7 billion years ago, and it's been expanding and cooling ever since.
Now you might be thinking, surely this assertion is true, isn't it? I mean, I've heard many well-respected scientists saying the same, haven't I? Well, the answer is that it depends. It depends on what definition of the word universe is being used. Allow me to explain. If we are using the scientific definition of the universe, that being all matter, space and time, then yes, it is accurate to say that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. But if we are using the colloquial definition of the universe, that being everything that exists, everything that has existed, and everything that will exist, then no, it is inaccurate to say that the Big Bang was the beginning of the universe. Hence, because Kreeft uses the scientific definition of the universe for the conclusion of this additional argument, but he uses the colloquial definition of the universe for the conclusion of his main argument, he therefore commits an equivocation fallacy, and hence his argument is invalid.
Whether or not Kreeft commits an equivocation fallacy is irrelevant, since Aquinas' argument has nothing to do with the distant past, but in Fraser's words, the here and now. Thus, this section of his video is entirely useless because it doesn't matter how old the universe is. Also, this isn't necessary to say, but in Aquinas' day there was not multiple definitions of the word universe, so he couldn't have even in principle committed this equivocation fallacy. But just remember, it's not applicable because we are talking about the here and now.
And the second faulty argument that Kreeft presents is the assertion that
Because Einstein's general theory of relativity says that all time is relative to matter, and since all matter began 13.7 billion years ago, so did all time. So there's no time before the Big Bang.
Now you might again be thinking, surely this one is correct, isn't it? But again, you'd be wrong. It's a false premise. To quote Sean Carroll, my all-time favourite theoretical physicist.
So a lot of cosmologists will say there was a beginning. And the problem with this is that the prediction that there's a beginning, or the understanding that there's a beginning, is based on general relativity, and we know general relativity is not right. The reason we know it's not right is because, for one thing, it is not compatible with quantum mechanics. So basically, we have a prediction that the universe began based on a theory we have no right to trust.
And hence, to quote Carroll again, the correct thing to say about the Big Bang is not that there was no time before it, but rather that our current understanding of the laws of physics give out at that moment in time. Or to put this in another way, just as Newton's law of universal gravitation functions perfectly when applied to our everyday lives, but fails when applied to celestial bodies, Einstein's general theory of relativity functions perfectly when applied to our everyday lives and celestial bodies, but it fails when applied to the Big Bang.
Again, this so-called faulty argument has no binding force on Aquinas' unmoved mover because it is talking about a single moment in time. It's saying that an unmoved mover has to exist to terminate this regression of actualizations that is taking place in the here and now. It has nothing to do with whether the theory of general relativity is correct.
When it comes to the question of what existed before the Big Bang, the real answer is we don't know. And to add "therefore God" to the end of this would be a classical argument from ignorance, which, indeed, is unfortunately exactly what many proponents of the unmoved mover do.
I'm going to play another clip from Mathema in which he sums up what serious theists think about God of the Gaps arguments and why the unmoved mover is no such argument.
It's important to point out that the very structure of these arguments involves reasoning from general features of experience and principles of causation to a most fundamental metaphysical source. Therefore, this is not even in principle a God of the Gaps explanation. A God of the Gaps explanation tends to identify some mysterious unexplained gap between two occurrences, and say that the gap is only explicable by saying God did it. These cosmological arguments, as is evident from their very form, do not seek to fill in a gap, or to explain any mysterious particular natural event. Interestingly, these God of the Gaps arguments were first identified by Christians criticizing other Christians for not seeing God in the totality of the cosmos as one continuous sustaining act, instead seeing God only in the gaps. Nowadays, this God of the Gaps point is mostly used by atheists to develop the narrative that natural theology bases itself on filling in the gaps in our scientific knowledge, whereas it does no such thing. Additionally, many atheists, almost as a matter of reflex, will criticize any theological argument, such as a cosmological argument, as being a God of the Gaps argument, without stopping to think whether the argument is even talking about a gap. As I've argued above, this is most certainly not the case in these arguments.
Anyhow, to recap, Kreeft's rendition of Aquinas' unmoved mover is flawed because,
Well, it's flawed because it's not actually Aquinas' argument.
even if every premise of the argument is accepted, it would not prove that Kreeft's specific God exists.
Well, it never seeks out to prove the totality of the Christian God. It just seeks out to prove certain aspects about him, mainly that a God exists, and then certain divine attributes like omnipotence.
And premise 3 commits a special pleading fallacy.
Now, no such special pleading fallacy is committed because, as we've seen, an infinite regression is impossible due to it being ordered essentially and what have you.
And the two additional arguments that Kreeft offers are flawed because the first commits an equivocation fallacy when used as a premise in Kreeft's main argument.
This equivocation fallacy is irrelevant because it doesn't apply to Aquinas' argument.
The second is simply false. It's a false premise.
Again, whether or not this is a false premise makes no difference on Aquinas' argument.
As always, thank you kindly for the view, and I'll leave you with yet another quote from the amazing Sean Carroll.
We use the phrase the Big Bang to refer to that earliest moment of the history of the universe where we don't understand what is going on. It's a placeholder for our lack of understanding.
Again, as so many things in this video unfortunately are, it's irrelevant. Alright guys, well I hope you enjoyed this video and saw that this quote-unquote debunking of Aquinas' unmoved mover was really just a representation of a straw man and then easily knocking it down, as it should be if it's a straw man. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below, and let me know if there's anything you guys want me to tackle next. So I'll catch you in the next one.